Regulatory update. Teach, Grant, and State Authorization Distance Education Final Regulations, featuring Dr. Sophia McArdle, Policy Analyst.
Hello, and thank you for attending. My name is Sophia McArdle. I'm with the Office of Post-Secondary Education, Policy Planning, and Innovation in the U.S. Department of Education. Today, I will be presenting a regulatory update on the Teach Grant program and state authorization of distance education. In the interest of time, I will not cover every aspect of the final regulations, but will highlight the most salient points. In 2007, Congress established the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education Grant Program. This was intended to help increase the number of teachers in high-need fields teaching in low-income schools. The Teach Grant Program is a non-need-based program that provides up to $4,000 per year to students enrolled in a Teach Grant-eligible program who agree to teach as a highly qualified teacher in a high-need field at a low-income elementary or secondary school for 4 years within 8 years of completing the program. Failing to complete the required teaching service requirement results in conversion of the Teach Grant to a federal direct unsubsidized loan with interest accruing from the date the grant was disbursed. The program provides grants of up to $4,000 per year for the first undergraduate or post-baccalaureate credential, up to an aggregate of $16,000, or $4,000 per year for a master's degree program, up to an aggregate amount of $8,000. The grants are prorated for less than full time, and the amount of Teach Grant in combination with other assistance may not exceed the cost of attendance. Applicants can be undergraduate students, graduate students pursuing a master's degree but not a doctorate, students enrolled in a post-baccalaureate teacher credential program, current or former teachers and retirees, and applicants must also meet the requirements under the student eligibility general provisions, submit a completed FAFSA. Even though this is a non-need-based program, the FAFSA is the application for this program. Sign an agreement to serve or repay, enroll in a Teach Grant eligible program, be completing or intend to complete coursework necessary to become a teacher, not have already earned a bachelor's or a post-baccalaureate, and met the academic achievement requirement of meeting the cumulative GPA of 3.25 as applicable, or scoring above the 75th percentile on one of the batteries of a nationally normed admissions test such as the GRE or ACT. So, what are the high-need fields? These include mathematics, science, foreign language, bilingual education and English language acquisition, special education, reading specialist, and another high-need field documented by the local, state, or federal government. With respect to the other high-need fields, state report these annually to the department as their teacher shortage areas. An institution must be Teach Grant eligible in order to disburse Teach Grants. To be a Teach Grant eligible institution, an institution must apply to participate in a Teach Grant program and be approved by the Secretary. The EAP is the application. In addition, the institution must be financially responsible and meet additional eligibility requirements. With respect to a Teach Grant eligible program, institutions have wide latitude to designate the Teach Grant eligible programs offered by the institution. The programs must be designed to prepare an individual to teach as a highly qualified teacher in a high-need field and lead to a bachelor's or master's degree program or be a post-baccalaureate program. A post-baccalaureate program is not a Teach Grant eligible program at an institution that offers both a post-baccalaureate program and a bachelor's in education. The department established the Accreditation and Innovation Committee and conducted negotiated rulemaking from January to April of 2019. There were 3 subcommittees: the Distance Learning and Education Innovation Subcommittee, the Faith-Based Subcommittee, and the Teach Grant Subcommittee. So why did the department negotiate rules for the Teach Grant program? Well, a Government Accountability Office report found in 2015 that as of September of 2014, Around 36,000 out of more than 112,000 Teach Grant recipients had not fulfilled Teach Grant requirements and had had their grants converted to loans, and over 2,200 Teach Grants were improperly converted to loans. The GAO concluded that due to the number of incorrectly converted grants, the department should better understand the reasons teachers do not meet program requirements, and program management should be improved, especially with respect to the grant to loan conversion dispute process. In addition, a 2018 study conducted for the department by the American Institutes for Research found that as of June of 2016, 63% of Teach Grant recipients who started their 8-year service obligation period before July of 2014 had their Teach Grants converted to unsubsidized loans because they did not meet the service obligation requirement or the annual certification requirements. The negotiations, the notice of proposed rulemaking, and final regulations are intended to address these concerns. This slide provides links to regulations published after the 2019 negotiated rulemaking. A notice of proposed rulemaking was published in December of 2019, followed by final regulations published in the Federal Register on August 14 of 2020. Let's talk about the implementation date of the final regulations. The Secretary exercised her authority under the Higher Education Act to designate the regulatory changes to regulations at 34 CFR Part 686, which is the Teach Grant program, included in the final regulations for early implementation beginning on August 14, 2020, at the discretion of each institution or each agency as appropriate. The department will implement the regulations as soon as possible after the implementation date and will publish a separate notice announcing the timing of the implementation. Otherwise, the final regulations are effective July 1 of 2021. To reiterate, the department believes the final regulations will reduce the number of Teach Grants that are converted to direct unsubsidized loans. So, what do the final regulations do? In summary, they expand the fields in which grant recipients can work to fulfill their service obligation. They simplify employment certification requirements. They require more information to be provided to recipients as part of entrance and exit counseling. They create conversion counseling to educate borrowers when their grants convert to loans and provide processes to correct improper conversions of Teach Grants to loans. There are several new and revised definitions that we provide in the regulations. Let's start with the new ones. We added a definition for educational service agency to mean a regional public multi-service agency authorized by state statute to develop, manage, and provide services or programs to local education agencies to reflect the addition of educational service agency made by the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008 to include educational service agencies in the description of a low-income school for purposes of Title IV student assistance programs, including TEACH. Since neither the Higher Education Act nor the current regulations define teacher shortage area nationwide list, we defined this as a list of teacher shortage areas in each state as defined under 34 CFR 682.210 Q8 Romanet 7, which defines the teacher shortage area to mean an area of specific grade, subject matter, or discipline classification, or a geographic area in which the Secretary determines that there is an inadequate supply of elementary or secondary school teachers. We made several revisions to the program. We changed agreement to serve to agreement to serve or repay. For the definition of highly qualified, we replaced the current definition with the full text of the statutory definition and added provisions describing how a public or other nonprofit private elementary or secondary school teacher exempt from state certification requirements can meet the highly qualified requirement. We defined school serving low-income students, low-income school, to be an elementary school, secondary school, or educational service agency listed in the department's teacher cancellation low-income directory. All elementary and secondary schools in educational service operated by the Bureau of Indian Education in the Department of Interior or operated on Indian reservations by Indian tribal groups under contract or grant with the Bureau of Indian Education qualify as schools or educational service agencies serving low-income students. We revised the current definition of a Teach Grant eligible program to make clear that a Teach Grant eligible program is a program of study at a Teach Grant eligible institution. This means that a program is Teach Grant eligible only if it is offered at an institution that participates in the Teach Grant program. Now let's talk about other amendments to the Teach Grant program. We've replaced references to submitting an application as designated by the Secretary with a reference to submitting the FAFSA and removed other provisions related to submitting the application because the FAFSA is the application for the Teach Grant program. There is no other application for the Teach Grant program. Let's talk about the agreement to serve and what the final regulations did. We amended the agreement to serve by changing the name of agreement to serve to agreement to serve or repay. We expanded the description of the contents of the agreement to serve or repay. We clarified the requirements for completion of more than one service obligation. We added language to explain the service obligation requirements for grant recipients who withdraw from an institution prior to completing the program for which Teach grants were received and later re-enroll. And we updated the conditions under which a Teach Grant recipient may satisfy the service obligation by teaching in a high-need field listed in the department's nationwide list. With respect to teaching in a high-need field on a nationwide list, we made revisions to reflect changes made to the Teach Grant program by the Higher Education Opportunity Act, such that for a recipient teaching in a high-need field listed in a nationwide list to count towards satisfying the recipient's service obligation, the high-need field in which he or she prepared to teach must be listed in the nationwide list for the state in which the recipient teaches for teaching before July 1 of 2010 at the time the recipient begins teaching in that field, even if that field subsequently loses its high-need designation for that state, or for teaching service performed on or after July 1 of 2010, at the time the recipient begins teaching in that field, even if that field subsequently loses its high-need designation for that state, or at the time the recipient signed the agreement to serve or repay or receive the Teach Grant, even if that field later loses its high-need designation for that state before the recipient begins teaching in that field. Related to teaching in a high-need field, we remove the prohibition on satisfying a service obligation by teaching in a high-need geographic area or grade level listed in a nationwide list, thereby expanding opportunities for Teach Grant recipients by allowing recipients to satisfy the service obligation by teaching in a high-need geographic area or grade level listed in the nationwide list. Next, we made several changes to initial, subsequent, and exit counseling. All three types of counseling must explain that if a recipient decides not to teach in a qualifying school or field, or for any other reason does not intend to satisfy the service obligation, the recipient can avoid further accrual of interest by asking the Secretary to convert the Teach Grant to a direct unsubsidized loan that the recipient can begin repaying immediately instead of waiting for the grant to be converted to a loan. If the recipient requests this loan conversion as soon as the recipient decides that he or she no longer intends to satisfy the service obligation and begins repaying the loan, this would reduce the amount of interest the individual must pay on the converted grant because interest would be charged from the date of each Teach Grant disbursement. For initial, subsequent, and exit counseling, all three must emphasize that once a Teach Grant is converted to a loan, it may be reconverted to a grant only if the Secretary determines that the recipient is satisfying the service obligation or that the grant has been converted to a loan in error, or for a Teach Grant recipient whose Teach Grant was converted to a direct unsubsidized loan in accordance with 686.43A1. This is where the recipient requests the conversion themselves. The recipient requests that the Secretary would reconvert the loan to a grant and is determined to be eligible for the reconversion. Initial and exit counseling must describe the conditions under which teaching in a high-need field may count towards satisfaction of the service obligation, and counseling must inform this to the recipient such that for teaching to count towards a service obligation, the high-need field must be one of the 6 high-need fields listed in 686.2 or a high-need field that is listed in the nationwide list for the state in which the grant recipient teaches at the time the grant recipient begins teaching in that field, even if the field subsequently loses its high-need designation for the state, or for teaching that is performed on or after July 1 of 2010, at the time the grant recipient signed the agreement to serve or repay or received the teach grant, even if that field subsequently loses its high-need designation for that state before the grant recipient begins teaching in the field. Exit counseling must review the terms and conditions of the teach grant agreement to serve or repay as described in 686.12, the agreement to serve or repay, and emphasize to the grant recipient that the 4-year service obligation must be completed within the 8-year period described in the agreement to serve or repay. It must also emphasize to the grant recipient that if the grant recipient fails or refuses to complete the service obligation contained in the agreement to serve or repay or fails to meet any other condition of the agreement to serve or repay, then the teach grant must be repaid as a direct unsubsidized loan, and the grant recipient will be obligated to repay the full amount of each grant and the accrued interest from each disbursement date. Exit counseling must also explain the treatment of a grant recipient who withdraws from and then re-enrolls in a teach grant eligible program at a teach grant eligible institution, and explain to the teach grant recipient that the secretary will, at least annually during the service obligation period, send the recipient the notice that is described in 686.43A2, which provides additional information on the grant. We also remove the requirement for recipients to annually provide the Secretary with documentation of their progress towards satisfying the service obligation or notice of their intent to satisfy the service obligation because that requirement was removed from the final regulations. The final regulations provide for a new conversion counseling requirement to provide counseling to recipients whose grants converted to loans. Because the Secretary makes the determination to convert a teach grant to a direct unsubsidized loan, the Secretary would provide the conversion counseling when recipient's grant converts to a loan. The actual conversion counseling would be provided through interactive electronic means and by mailing written counseling materials to the most recent address provided by the recipient. The regulations mirror the direct loan exit counseling requirements as relevant to the teach grant and include all elements removed from the current exit counseling. With respect to documenting a service obligation, we remove the requirement for grant recipients to confirm their status within 120 days of ceasing enrollment in a program for which they received a teach grant. As already mentioned, we eliminated the rule prohibiting a teach grant recipient from satisfying a service obligation by teaching in a geographic region of a state or in a specific grade level not associated with a high-need field for a state that is designated in a nationwide list. We added that a recipient who completes at least half of an academic year of qualifying teaching and other applicable requirements could have that partial year of teaching count as a full year of the 4 years of teaching if the recipient is unable to teach for the remainder of the academic year because he or she resides in or is employed in a federally declared major disaster area as defined in the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. We added periods of suspension. A recipient certified to teach in one state may move to a different state and be unable to teach in that state until he or she has received state-required instruction provided by the state or otherwise fulfilled state requirements for licensure in that state's elementary or secondary schools. So, to ensure that the grant recipient would be able to complete the required 4 years of teaching within the 8-year service obligation period, the grant recipient is allowed to receive a temporary suspension of the 8-year period while he or she is fulfilling the new state's teacher licensure requirements. We added a new suspension option for grant recipients who are military spouses to cover circumstances where the recipient spouse receives military orders for deployment with a military unit or as an individual in support of a call to federal or state active duty or active service, or receives orders for a change of permanent duty station from a location in the continental United States to a location outside of the continental United States, or from a location in a state to any location outside the state, as it may not be possible for the recipient to find a teaching position in a high-need field in a low-income school in the new location. We also added a new suspension condition that allows a recipient to request a suspension of the service obligation period due to being based in or residing in or being employed in a federally declared major disaster area. As there could be other unforeseen circumstances that might temporarily prevent a grant recipient from fulfilling the service obligation requirements, a provision was added allowing the Secretary to grant temporary suspensions on a case-by-case basis if the Secretary determines that there are exceptional circumstances affecting the operation of the school or educational service agency where the grant recipient teaches or the recipient's ability to teach. Also, to ensure that grant recipients are informed of the status of an application for suspension, the Secretary will notify the grant recipient regarding the outcome of an application for suspension. We also updated the requirements and procedures for receiving a discharge of the Teach Grant service obligation based on a total and permanent disability. Our experience in administering the Teach Grant program has shown that the existing regulatory conditions for converting Teach Grants to loans are difficult for recipients to understand and, in some cases, have led to conversions of grants made to recipients who are performing qualifying teaching service but who fail to meet certification deadlines. Thus, to simplify program requirements, reduce burden on recipients, and minimize grant to loan conversions resulting from late submission of documentation, we simplified the conversion rules of Teach Grants to direct unsubsidized loans so that the conversion would only occur if the recipient requests conversion or fails to begin or maintain qualifying teaching service within a timeline that would allow the recipient to complete the service obligation within the 8-year service obligation period. We added an annual notice that the Secretary will send to the grant recipient to remind them of the service obligation requirements and specify that the Secretary will notify grant recipients in advance of the final date by which they must submit documentation of qualifying teaching service to avoid loan conversion. We describe the information the Secretary will provide to a grant recipients whose grants are converted to loans, including information about the process by which a grant recipient may request reconsideration of the conversion, and provided that if a grant recipient's Teach Grant was converted to a direct unsubsidized loan in accordance with paragraph A1 Romanet II of this section, that's the non-voluntary conversion, the Secretary will reconvert the loan to a grant based on documentation provided by the recipient or in the Secretary's own records showing that he or she is satisfying the service obligation or that the grant was converted to a loan in error. We specify the actions the Secretary takes if a grant recipient who requests reconsideration demonstrates to the satisfaction of the Secretary that the Teach Grant was converted to a loan in error. In this case, the loan is reconverted and already completed qualifying teaching service is applied to the service obligation. The recipient is provided with an additional period of time equal to 8 years minus the number of full academic years of teaching that the recipient completed prior to reconversion of the loan to a Teach Grant, including any years of qualifying teaching completed during the period when the grant was incorrectly in loan status to complete the remainder of the service obligation. The recipient will automatically be provided with a statement of error when a grant that was incorrectly converted to a loan is later reconverted to a Teach Grant. If a recipient who requests reconsideration does not demonstrate to the Secretary's satisfaction that a Teach Grant was converted to a loan in error, the Secretary notifies the recipient that the loan cannot be converted to a Teach Grant, explains the reason or reasons why the loan cannot be converted to a Teach Grant, and explains how the recipient may contact the Federal Student Aid Ombudsman if he or she continues to believe that the Teach Grant was converted to a loan in error. If the grant was converted to a loan at the recipient's request, we specified that the Secretary will reconvert the loan to a grant and restore the recipient's service obligation if the Secretary receives a request from the recipient to reconvert such loan and there is sufficient time remaining for the recipient to complete the service obligation. Let's talk about the Teach Grant program as related to COVID-19. There are links to two relevant electronic announcements in the slide. The CARES Act provides that if previously qualifying teaching service becomes part-time or is temporarily interrupted as a result of a qualifying emergency, that teaching service is considered full-time and fulfills the service obligation requirement under the Teach Grant program. In addition, the department is extending the deadline for all flexibilities related to the COVID-19 emergency through the end of the payment period that includes December 31 of 2020 or at the end of the payment period that includes the end date for the federally declared emergency related to COVID-19, whichever occurs later. Now, let's turn to the final regulations for state authorization of distance education. Before we dive into state authorization of distance education, I want to provide background and context for this. So let's talk about the requirements in general. Under the Higher Education Act, for an institution in any state to be eligible to participate in federal programs, it must be legally authorized by the state to provide post-secondary education. The Higher Education Act defines institution of higher education to mean, in part, an educational institution in any state that is legally authorized within a state to provide a program of education beyond secondary education. And the Higher Education Act provides that a proprietary institution of higher education and a post-secondary vocational institution must be legally authorized within a state to provide a program of education beyond secondary education. Although legal authorization by a state has been required always and is a basic building block of institutional eligibility for federal aid, before October of 2010, there was no definition or description in the regulations. The development of the state authorization regulations occurred as part of a negotiated rulemaking that occurred in 2010. And those final regulations clarified that state approval to offer post-secondary educational programs is a substantive requirement where the state is expected to take an active role for approving an institution and monitoring complaints from the public about its operations and responding appropriately. This slide basically takes you to these regulations, specifically the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking from 2010, final regulations published October 29 of 2010, and technical corrections that were published in April of 2011. So what are these regulations doing? For institutional eligibility purposes for federal programs, the state authorization regulations assure a state role in authorizing post-secondary institutions and clarify what is required for an institution to be considered legally authorized by a state. Let's talk about this first point a bit, about assuring the state role in authorizing post-secondary institutions. The Higher Education Act envisioned a triad of oversight by the government, that's the department, the states, and accrediting agencies. The regulations clarify the roles of each of these participants in establishing an institution's eligibility for federal programs. It's important to remember that the department regulates institutions and not states. Just to be clear, the department does not provide state authorization. This is done by a state and is a state matter. On a second point, the regulations provide for how various types of institutions would be considered to be legally authorized. Broadly, there are two parts for state authorization: the basis of operating authority for the school and any required approvals from the state, and the state's process for student complaints. Related to state authorization, but not part of the regulations under 600.9, are student consumer information requirements. On June 12, 2019, after a series of lawsuits and delays regarding state authorization of distance education, and after the 2019 negotiated rulemaking, a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposed rules for state authorization of distance education was published. Final regulations were published on November 1, 2019, with an effective date of July 1 of 2020. So what is contained in the final regulations? One non-distance specific related provision concerns the definition of a religious institution. The final regulations amend the current definition of a religious institution used for state authorization purposes in 600.9b to be an institution legally authorized to operate educational programs beyond secondary education if it is exempt as a religious institution from state authorization under the state constitution or by state law. However, it must still provide a state complaint process. With respect to state authorization of distance education, the final regulations defined a state authorization reciprocity agreement. This is an agreement between two or more states that authorizes an institution located and legally authorized in a state covered by the agreement to provide post-secondary education through distance education or correspondence to students located in other states covered by the agreement and cannot prohibit any member state of the agreement from enforcing its own general purpose state laws and regulations outside of the state authorization of distance education. If an institution that meets the requirements under paragraph A1 or B of the section referring to the physical location pieces of state authorization, if the institution offers post-secondary education through distance or correspondence to students located in a state in which the institution is not physically located or in which the institution is otherwise subject to that state's jurisdiction as determined by the state, except as we've provided in paragraph C1 II of the section that refers to the state reciprocity agreements, the institution must meet any of that state requirements for it to be legally offering post-secondary distance education or correspondence in that state. The institution must, upon request, document the state's approval to the secretary, or if an institution that meets the requirements under paragraph A1 or B of this section offers post-secondary education through distance or correspondence in a state that does participate in a state authorization reciprocity agreement, and the institution is covered by such an agreement, the institution is considered to meet state requirements for it to be legally offering post-secondary distance or correspondence in that state, subject to any limitations in that state and to any additional requirements of that state not relating to state authorization of distance education. The institution must, upon request, document such coverage to the secretary. So, in summary, to this point, we have revised the regulations to be consistent with the revised definition of a state authorization reciprocity agreement. We provide that an institution covered by a reciprocity agreement is considered to meet state requirements for it to be legally offering post-secondary distance or correspondence in the state, subject to any limitations in that agreement and to any additional requirements of the state not relating to state authorization of distance education. Further, these revisions apply to institutions described in 600.9A1 or 600.9B, refer to a student's location, not residence. The reference to location, not residence, is also reflected in the revised definition of a state authorization reciprocity agreement. Let's talk about determining student location. The institution determines the student's location at the time of initial enrollment based on the information provided by the student and upon receipt of information from the student that the location has changed in accordance with the institution's procedures. Institutions may, however, develop procedures for determining student location that are best suited to their organization and the student population they serve. Institutions must consistently apply their policies and procedures regarding student location to all students, including students enrolled in brick and mortar programs. And upon request, institutions must provide the secretary with written documentation of its determination of a student's location, including the basis for such determination. With respect to determining time of enrollment for determining a student's location, the location is determined at the time of a student's initial enrollment in a program as opposed to the time of a student's initial application to the institution. We did not attach any further conditions to this determination. With respect to formal receipt of information regarding change of location, this information will come from the student to the institution in accordance with the institution's procedures for changing their location to another state. An institution would need to establish or maintain and document the change of address process. With respect to the state complaint process, the regulations for a state complaint process under 600.9C2 have been removed, but current 600.9A1 continues to address the state complaint process. Nothing in the regulation prevents a state from providing a state complaint process that an institution offering distance would have to comply with in order to operate in that state unless The state and institution have joined a reciprocity agreement that provides an alternate means for addressing student complaints. Current 668.43b requires an institution to provide its students or prospective students with contact information for filing complaints with its state approval or licensing entity and any other relevant state official or agency that would appropriately handle a student's complaint. The institution would need to have such information to provide, or it would be out of compliance with the regulations. Let's talk about disclosures. Please note that these disclosures apply to all institutions. We've already talked about the institutional requirement to disclose information about state authorization and state-based complaint systems. If an educational program is designed to advertise to meet educational requirements for a specific professional license or certification required for employment in an occupation, the institution must disclose if program completion is sufficient to meet licensure requirements in the state for that occupation, including a list of all states that the institution has determined its programs will meet, will not meet, or has not made a determination regarding such requirement. An institution must make individualized disclosures to prospective students for any program designed or advertised to meet student licensure requirements when its program would not meet educational prerequisites for licensure in a state where its students are located, or if the institution is not determined if that program would meet such requirements prior to a student's enrollment in a program. And an institution is required to make individualized disclosures to enrolled students in any program designed or advertised to meet state licensure requirements if the institution determines that the program no longer meets such requirements in the state where the student is located within 14 calendar days of that determination. It is important to note that individualized disclosures related to licensure or certification must be made directly to a student in writing, which can be through email, and an institution must determine a student's location using a process applied consistently to all students and must make such determination at the time of a student's initial enrollment and upon formal receipt of information from the student that the student's location has changed to another state. Finally, the institution must, upon request, provide written documentation of its determination of a student location, including the basis for such determination. This concludes the state authorization of distance education portion of the presentation, as well as the presentation itself. Thank you very much for attending.